sufficient information, which is a hard sweet spot. And we can come back and talk about that
Yeah,
too.
absolutely. Raquel?
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I said it earlier when we talked about fiduciary. It all sort of needs to go back to the mission. I don't know if it always goes back to that, but when you think about sports, folks are students first, right? And so, how do we make sure that we're giving students what they need as they're being scholar athletes, right? Which is really important. And so, those decisions have to necessarily be tempered by the mission. But I think it's also important to think about, what role does the board play in thinking out the budget, financial budget that has to do with athletics, right? Thinking about how much can we pay this big time coach, right, to kind of bring the championships, right, and all these different things. And so I think it's a really important piece because folks are interested in the donor aspect of it, the elite fundraising aspect of it, and the money that boosters, all these things can bring into your institution. And it's just, how do we make sure we do these things in a compliance to Title IX, all these different rules and regulations that we have on campuses. So yeah.
Tons of rules and regulations. And for a long time, we've had many NCAA rules and regulations, which seem to have been obliterated by all the court cases that are out there right now. So it's a great deal of uncertainty, even for how athletic directors function, let alone presidents and trustees. So I know you both do board training. So let's talk a little bit about what that structure might look like. What are some examples of when you've been brought in to do some training, how that works, that type of thing?
Yeah,
Go
you
ahead,
want me to
Peter.
start, Peter?
All right.
So I can
Sure,
start, I
Raquel, go
guess,
ahead.
and then you can chime in. I think the biggest thing, and Peter sort of alluded to this as well, is that boards often have to leverage experts that aren't themselves, right? Because they're not trained in higher education. Like, they don't have a robust background in higher education. And, that's intentional. The idea of boards is sort of they bring in folks who have expertise in different fields that come together, and then, we become stronger because this person is really great at, in the political arena, this person's really great at real estate, whatever the case may be. There's a doctor or whatever. And so you bring them together. And so board training is really essential to understand how everything works in this complicated place called academia, right? On these colleges and universities. And so that's really important for them to understand what is their purview, what is their role and responsibilities, because you can imagine if folks are coming in, they're captains of industry, and they're able to sort of snap their fingers and say, this is how it's going to be done. And then they get into a place where they're now, as Dick Chait talks about, they're soloists now and part of a choir, right? Like, everyone's a soloist, is great soloist, and now they have to learn how to sort of blend and work together. It can be complicated. And so oftentimes folks bring in consultants and experts to help them understand the business that is higher education. Like, how does this work? What are our goals, right? And understanding key things of access, graduation rates, some of these core pieces. And then so they can think about the business aspect of it. But I think that that's the biggest piece when you think about training of a board, is knowing where their authority lies versus the other decision-making bodies. And you think about shared governance, right? This is something that folks really have to try to understand, is the board has a lot of authority, but they do not sort of own and control higher education in and of themselves, right? Like, there's a faculty who also control what's happening in classrooms and curriculum, right? There's also the president or the chancellor, right? And so helping boards to understand not only their role, but what is the role of these other decision-making bodies so that they can all work together, again, to push forward the mission, to center student success, and all of these things that we know matter for our colleges and universities.
Great. For me, boards call me when they're going through transition. So you can think about kind of three categories of boards broadly. There are very good boards. They don't call us because they don't need any help because they're doing a great job. The other end of the continuum are boards that are dysfunctional. They don't call us because they're dysfunctional and don't think anyone can help them. It's the group in the middle that are really going through some transition. So there's often a board, there's a point of evolution. It could be sometimes it's a pivot. Is there a new president? Is there something that's happened, a shock to the system of whatever it could be? Demographic cliff, enrollment shortages, changing politics in the state, accreditation review, but is there a pivot point, new strategic plan, at which the board recognizes or starts to ask itself, how we've been doing things may not in the past, may not be the best way that's going to support the board, the institution, and the mission moving forward. And so how can we take stock, rethink our work, reflect on it more intentionally, and then develop a plan for action and moving ahead as well. And there are, again, some boards and presidents are ready to do this work, and other boards, they're not going to ask these questions. And I think where we need to move towards, I'm anticipating a future question, is these much more agile, responsive, and fluid governing boards and governing structures that are able to address very different needs and issues. Athletics is one, but there's a lot of other issues: AI, changing demographics, what's happening in the economies in different states. Boards need to be able to say, again, have that reflective capacity to say, are we doing what we need to do? Is this the best way to do our work? How can we do it differently, better? And should we be doing different work as well?
When you both have done training or even just had conversations with individual board members, so many times, at least I read in news articles and listen to conversations from folks, they reflect on what they've read in the media. And oftentimes what they've read in the media reflects the highest schools, the Power Four schools, the Big Ten schools, the SEC, which for most people, that world doesn't apply to them. It really doesn't, but that's all they seem to want to talk about. And this is most clearly pronounced in name, image, and likeness, NIL. And I have seen where board members come in and they want to talk about NIL and how we can raise money to make sure we have enough NIL. And meanwhile, some of your teams don't have fields, they don't have locker rooms. You're not thinking about the priorities of the institution because in some cases, the board members are reacting to what they read in the newspaper that morning. How do we help board members overcome that kind of bias that they might have in what they're reading?
I think a key piece is to be able to have an intentional and ongoing board education. And so that very much can kind of help boards understand within athletics, for example, what are the areas that we should be focusing on? And is it really NIL as our top priority? Or are there other ones related to facilities, related to student experience, related to student success? And again, Division One, our conference is Division One, Division Three. Those are some pretty different conversations. There are threads that span across them, but the realities of the business model, the pressures on institutions, on presidents, on athletic directors and coaches are very different at D1 and D3. Before NIL, when I was serving on a board over 10 years, 12 years, I think we talked about athletics like 3 times. Because and where it came from is one of our trustees went to one of the athletic events and thought the way the coach was behaving was antithetical to the values of the university.
Yes.
And wanted to talk about the values of the university and how athletics is or is not advancing those values. And I thought that was a great question. It wasn't about win-loss. It was really about mission, purpose, and really at the bottom line, the student experience. A religiously affiliated residential campus, that's who they are. And so it was great that he brought that into the conversation. But helping trustees understand what are the diversity, the breadth of issues that are associated with any issue, and athletics in particular, all the complexity. How can we kind of carve out some of those areas to focus on as well? And if you do board education, then you know the hierarchy of different priorities and different issues related to.
Yeah.
And I just want to echo that because what I think the challenge is, 100% board education. Very few people have a proximity to boards, which is why when they read stuff, they're like, oh, this is it, right? You think about, you may not want to be a teacher, but you've been in the classroom. So you kind of know what a teacher does. Most folks don't know what boards of higher education do unless you're in it, right? And so it's really a learn on the job type of thing. And so it makes sense that people are trying to read and see what they can get because until you've gone through it, you don't know how to address these issues, right? And so I think, just to add to Peter's point, I think it has to be really proactive education, right? To kind of say, here are some potential things, right, that you may face or you deal with. And so that you're equipped with that prior to you actually kind of are addressing it, right, head on. But I think it's a really hard job because you just don't know what it is until you're in it, right? I've worked with some boards and folks have said, it took me 2 years to figure out where the bathroom is at this place. And, obviously that's hyperbole, but they're saying like it really just takes a while to get it going, to figure out, get in the groove of what governance is, what their decision-making authority is, how this works, right? You have folks who are only meeting episodically, maybe 4 to 6 times a year, right? This is not their main gig. They're volunteers. They don't know higher education well. And so you have to continue to equip them to be great, right? We can't just put these folks in a room and think they're going to make all of the best decisions. Folks who have years and years of training, decades of training, still err, right? Sometimes. So I think it's really important that we understand that there's a learning curve with boards. And unless we're proactive in helping to equip them with the knowledge they need, right, the experience, the skills, they may not perform. And that's not a knock on them. That is a knock on the folks who are supposed to make sure that they're equipped to perform in that role.
Right. That leads me to my next question. So whose responsibility is it to ensure that the board is fully educated on some of these? Is it the president whose job to poll the board members and say, okay, what would you like to learn about? Or to say, this is what I think you need to learn about. Or is there some sort of national agenda that helps boards kind of manage all of these moving parts, not just athletics, but all the changes in AI and some of the other things?
Kelly, you want to go first?
Sure, I can go first. I mean, when you said whose responsibility is it? I mean, the president actually serves at the pleasure of the board, right? So the board is the boss of the president. So it does seem kind of opposite and illogical at ways to have the board then listen to the president, right, and defer. So, I mean, I think it's a whole
Yes.
wonky process that we have. So we have to kind of figure that out. But this is where we are. So, yes, I think they lean a lot on the president and the chancellor. The challenge with that becomes, what if that person isn't leading them in the right direction, isn't helping them to get the information that they need? Then what do you do, right? And so many boards rely on, there's a board staff, right? There's a board secretary and that sort of thing. So requiring those folks to really kind of give them their board briefings, whether that's still paper or whether it's online. Most boards are using online now, which is really great, but to get them up to speed, right? And then they're using their meetings, especially their committee meetings, to bring in folks from the campus to really talk to them and explain what's happening, right? They get that interface with key stakeholders. And so that's really important. They have to hear from the folks who are actually on the ground doing the work, right? And I think that that's a big piece and where they're learning this process from. I think the biggest thing for boards that they have to understand is the power of their question. Like board inquiry is really important. They have to be able to ask questions. They may not know the answers, right? But they have to ask questions of things so that that's their level of accountability, right? That they're able to hold folks accountable through their questions, because it's really important that boards don't get into the management of things. They don't get into the weeds of things. They need to really see it at this 50-foot level, right? And see all of these different things. And they're thinking about today, but they also are really in charge of long-term plannings, right? So you can't get focused on all the knickknacks of today if you're trying to also make sure that the institution is well equipped for tomorrow, right? And decades down the road. So I think that's really important. What questions are they asking? And so when we're preparing boards, it's really important. And I'm sure Peter can talk about this, but his idea of like, what's a good question? Good to great questions. How do we help them go from these mediocre questions to great questions? Because he does this really great job of that. But I think that's the big piece, is we want to have boards feel empowered to ask these questions and not necessarily move and make, decisions, but how do they ask questions of the experts so that they, again, are centering that mission and doing that really great work. And then the last piece I'll say is we can't negate or not pay attention to sort of external accountability, right? Our students, the community stakeholders, and how those folks can also help to train boards to understand what is specific to that place, right? Where your institution is, depending on the city, all these different markers that make you have this nuanced identity. Those things matter for your decision making too. What decisions work for the UC will not work for UPenn, right? And vice versa. And I think it's really important. In some ways, yes, but in many ways, no, because we're dealing with different students. We're dealing with different geography. D1 sports, yes, right? But, in the Ivies, they're not giving scholarships, right? So it's all very, very different in how these things work. So, yeah.
Yeah. Peter?
Yeah, I would add that the information flow is really, the board education is really, it's often presidential driven or staff driven, but we also want the chairs to be able to be driving the conversations within the boardrooms and asking individual trustees, what information do you need? What would be helpful to you to be able to do your job better, to ask better questions, better, more informed questions in the boardroom? And so the board leaders, the chair, vice chairs, committee chairs are really going to take that responsibility around what does the board need to know. But it's a conversation. If we assume goodwill, it's a conversation and a healthy constructive dialogue between the president and the board. As Raquel said, when the board is up to no good or the president is up to no good, then it's a very different set of conversations as well. Or if the campus has moved in the wrong direction, if the place is in crisis mode, it's a different conversation, different set of work at the board.
Yeah.
And that crisis mode can vary by institutions. And surprise, surprise, we do see a few athletic crises here and there. I'm
Shocking.
sure you even talked about them on your podcast.
Every now and then.
And in your book too.
Oh, perhaps, yes. So let's say we've got a crisis. We're a Division I program.